Hello and welcome back. Today we will be continuing our Victoria 3 tutorial series, and we're going to be talking about standard of living. This has been a very widely requested tutorial topic. We're going to first discuss what is standard of living and why is it good, and then we will discuss many different ways in which you can boost standard of living, and kind of finish that off with a bit of a tail end, which is kind of my opinion, that standard of living is actually not a very good goal to play for. Instead, you should think of an increasing standard of living as a really good marker to have, because it's an indication that good things are going on in your economy, but it's not really a be-all end-all kind of marker of progress, because some of the ways you boost standard of living are not really that good for your overall game and economy. And so without further ado, let's get into it. In order to properly explain standard of living, we're going to have to talk about two adjacent concepts that are very, very closely related to standard of living. And the first and most critical one is going to be wealth level. Now, your wealth level is going to be the very, very strong determiner of what your standard of living is. And in fact, you can think of wealth as your base standard of living. You see here, we have a wealth of 9. This is most of what's informing our standard of living here of 10. And for the most part, this will be your standard of living kind of metric, but there's going to be several modifiers that stack on top of this. Like, for example, you can see here, our public health insurance is increasing standard of living, and pollution impact is decreasing it. However, if you move wealth up or down, you are going to move standard of living, and this is going to be how most of the movements in standard of living occur. However, it's important to emphasize that wealth is distinct from standard of living, so we can't just, increase standard of living through, let's say, using public health insurance and then expect to increase, the level of literacy with private schools, because private schools is giving education access based on wealth, not standard of living. Now, I will often misspeak probably throughout this tutorial regarding wealth and standard of living because of how wealth is just kind of your base standard of living. But the way that wealth works is every pop for a given wealth level will have a basket of goods that they need to consume in order to stay at that level. If they have an amount of money in excess of that basket of goods price for an extended period of time, then their wealth will go up. And if they have an amount that is under the price of that basket of goods for an extended period of time, their wealth will go down. And so a huge driver of what your wealth levels are going to be is, shocker, the level of your income. This is influenced by a variety of factors, including taxes. The more you tax your pops, the less money they will have to dedicate to their basket of goods, but also it will be influenced by the prices in the market for the amount or quantities of the goods that they need to purchase. And so if goods are generally expensive in the market, this is going to decrease wealth, which will further decrease standard of living. And so this is going to be the huge driver, or the biggest driver. There's a lot of other modifiers, especially in events, that can influence standard of living, but the easiest and best way to think about it is that it is going to be primarily a wealth-driven thing, and this is going to be, influenced by increasing the income of your pops or your pop groups more than anything else, and then it's also going to matter about decreasing their expenses, both in needs and taxes, so that they can have a big excess, and then after a period of time, while running in excess, their wealth level will go up, the basket of goods they will consume will need to be more expensive, and eventually they will reach an equilibrium level of both wealth and, consequently, standard of living. The most important benefit of increasing standard of living is to help grow your population, and you do it in two ways, and we're not going to unpack these two ways in anything remotely a complete way, because they would each need their own video. But the first is just regular population growth, your annual projected pop growth, which is a cross-section of your pop growth, which will actually, or your birth rate, which will actually decrease as standard of living goes up, and mortality, which will also decrease as standard of living goes up. The number you need to know is that at 20 SOL, pop growth is maximized. Anything above that in pop growth will start to go down until I think it's either 25 or 30, at which point it flattens out. And so if you get a higher standard of living, you will have more pop growth. A bigger driver of getting more pops, though, is generally going to be migration, depending on how the rest of what you're playing looks like. And what it's going to be is double the standard of living in a province is going to provide a base level for your standard of living migration attraction. You can see here 25.9, roughly 26 is the amount we're getting for migration attraction, and then it's going to be multiplied by all of our multiplicative modifiers. If we take a look at our average standard of living, it's 12.9, roughly speaking, half of that, through paradox math. And so we're going to be having an attraction from our standard of living, and so this is going to be the primary driver because this allows us to get more pops. Souls are the most important resource in the game, and having more of them allows you to have more opportunities to build profitable buildings because you will have a lot of peasants, and when you de-peasant pops, when you move a pop from a peasant job or even unemployed to another job, you generally have a net gain of value that is much larger than moving one gainfully employed guy to another gainfully employed job that's just a little bit more efficient. Another very important benefit of wealth, not standard of living, is going to be education access that is wealth-based, and this is going to be a base value that you achieve just from base, as well as the research of 3 technologies: rationalism, academia, and empiricism, and this is the equivalent of 4 levels of the private school's institution, and so this is going to be very valuable. Related to that, and also an important aspect, again, we are not going to be covering this in a complete way, is that you will generally have much better qualifications as you increase standard of living, and once you kind of reach a certain threshold, qualifications will no longer be an issue for you regarding standard of living, and driving standard of living up to 12 or perhaps a little bit above it generally solves all of your problems, but this is an important reason to want to increase standard of living. But for a lot of pops, the wealth is going to be the bigger driver for the qualifications rather than the standard of living. And so while we're thinking of driving up standard of living, we kind of think of driving up standard of living and wealth at the same time, or we do it in a lot of the same ways. It is going to matter for wealth though, so getting public health insurance will generally not increase your qualifications, but increasing your wealth will increase your qualifications. Most of the strategy you use for increasing your standard of living is increasing your wealth level. Finally, standard of living will have a big impact on the radicals you generate in a couple of ways. The first is expected standard of living, which is driven by a variety of things. It is driven by whatever strata you are, giving you a base value, and it is increased by a variety of technologies. We have a little bit of a spreadsheet thing here, which is showing, the modifier of what level of standard of living you need or in order to satisfy the pops. It is also affected by literacy, and so they will demand more standard of living per literacy as a result of these technologies, and so literacy is important. So the more literate your pops, the more you're going to need from them. And you can see here for the lower strata, for example, with all of the technologies and 100% literacy, you would have a minimum expected standard of living of 15, as opposed to only having one of the technologies and 25% literacy, you'd only need 6.5. So this will affect things. We don't want to get too into the weeds on that, but your expected standard of living, if they're below that, they're going to be upset. Unincorporated status also has an effect. And also, standard of living is going to be a driver of the creation of loyalists and radicals from standard of living going up or down, which is generally from wealth going up or down, but not always. You could, for example, decrease your health institution, and you will get 6% radicals when SOL decreases and 4% loyalists when SOL increases. It's important to note there's a whole bunch of modifiers that can give you more radicals when SOL decreases or less radicals, and a whole bunch that increase and decrease loyalists. Radicalism is not really the subject matter of this tutorial, but an important example, if we just hop back into game, we can just take a look at a very good example of this, is going to be the institution for, guaranteed liberties, which will give you minus radicals from standard of living increases, or decreases rather, and increased loyalists from standard of living increases. At max level, this is going to be 25%, and so that 4 would be turned into a plus 5%, and that minus 6% would be turned into a just under 5%. So in theory, this alone allows you to generate, positive, loyalists from increasing and decreasing standard of living alone. There are a few other reasons that, increasing standard of living can be good, or increasing wealth can be good. The two are very closely related, such as political activity, getting, the trade unionists demarginalized and this sort of thing. But we're not going to jump into every single example of where increasing standard of living is important, but increasing average OSOL will also help to empower the trade unions, which is generally seen as being a very strong interest group. Okay, so how do we increase SOL? the most important kind of thing to have a strategy for is going to be taxation level. And the first, you might notice as well, you do get a radicalism bonus or malus depending on your taxation level, and so this is worth noting just for the radicalism discussion. But for taxation level, the most important reason to increase standard of living is to gain pops. If you decrease taxes, you will decrease the basket of goods, or you will decrease the proportion of their income that is going to taxes. This is fairly straightforward. You can see right now it's 15% for our lower strata, 23 and 25%. If we decrease taxes to a minimum value, you will see, if we just let the game update after a brief Monday, you will see this collapse to 6%, 10%, and 6.8%. And so the most straightforward way of creating excess value for your pops, because you can see the excess gone way up from this, is to just decrease taxes. However, there is quite a bit of tension here, because generally speaking, you will want to run high taxes so you can afford a lot of construction so that you can de-peasant pops. Often the general strategy is going to be, as long as you have a lot of peasants, you want to keep taxes high. As you run out of peasants, you want to decrease taxes to increase standard of living. This is a general heuristic. It's greatly affected by 1.6, and I don't have a large enough sample size to really know what's going to be best, because it seems that SOL is less important in migration as it has been in previous patches. But as you run out of pops, you will often want to decrease taxes just to get some more, or this has been the strategy historically speaking that might not hold as much as it used to be, but if you have a lot of peasants, then cranking it up and creating a ton of new jobs is going to be helpful, and it's also going to be helpful for increasing SOL. So that's kind of thing one we discussed, looking at kind of this sort of menu here as being a huge driver of thinking about increasing SOL. We want to increase the excess. The second portion of the taxation strategy that's going to be important for increasing SOL, and by this we mean average SOL, is going to have to do with consumption taxes strategy, but this one's a little bit more complicated. You see, pops, as they increase in wealth, they are going to demand more and more goods. Yes, we understand this. However, the way they increase their demand is not in a linear way. As you go up the wealth ladder, you are actually going to increase the amount that you are demanded more and more. And so you can take a look here, we see the income here for the wealthy who have a standard of living of 41 is 200 to maintain that income. That is an enormous level of income relative to the middling strata, which has, roughly speaking, half the standard of living level, which is not necessarily the wealth level, but has a tenth of the income. And so the more and more money you have, the more and more money it will require to increase your wealth level, which means if we are going to take money from anyone using our taxation strategy, we want to peel as much money off of the wealthy as possible, because taking money from them will decrease wealth levels less than taking it from another pop. Another way to think of it is that if we take 18 ducats from this guy, we will have taken everything that a single pop owns. We will have reduced one pop or one individual from 19 standard of living to 0, right? By taking away 18 ducats. If we take away 18 from these guys, we'll just reduce them from 41 to 40 or to 39 or something like this. We would have to reduce this by 200 income. If we were to reduce the income of the middle strata from, or take away 200 ducats from them in terms of our tax strategy, we would reduce, roughly speaking, 10 of these guys from SOL 19 to 0, which will pull down the average, quite a bit more than reducing one guy from 41 to 0. And so it's going to be important to target the upper strata in order to improve the average SOL in terms of your tax strategy. Okay, so what does this mean for us? This means that for our consumption taxes, we want to be specifically targeting goods that are purchased by the upper strata and not the lower stratas as much as we can. However, sometimes you just want to build more. But what this means is looking in here, and we can see transportation and services are consumed the most by the upper strata, but we see here services are consumed by the middle strata quite a bit, and so we could do something like go after transportation, go after, luxury goods of all kinds, and in this way we could target our, taxes on the upper strata. It's important to note that these consumption taxes, they do not decrease consumption in any sort of way. It does not make your pops buy a different basket of goods. It just increases the price of the basket of goods. And so if we take a look at, our population now, we can see that they're paying 6.8 in taxes and 10.0 in taxes. If we take out all the consumption taxes, we can get a little bit of a baseline to take a look at in terms of what's going on for us. So we see 6.8, 10.1. As soon as we wait until the next Monday, which takes a bit of a time, we can see that the taxes have gone up. Wait, what? What? Oh, that's because we increased them back up as well, in addition to this. So we have a new baseline, though. We have this baseline of 13% and 21%. What we would like to do is increase the taxes, generate a ton of revenue for more construction, but target the upper strata. And so this will often mean not targeting a consumption taxing alcohol. We see that here we have a bit of a decision to make. We could go for services. This will be the most efficient on a per authority basis, just slightly over porcelain, but it's going to target the middle strata a little bit more. That's okay. We really don't want to target the lower strata, so opium, for example, is not something we would want to consumption tax, even if it's going to generate us a lot of money. So we'll go in on the services, we'll go in on the porcelain, and then now we'll take a look, and transportation is probably going to be the next most efficient, but of the ones we can put in, we see the opium. We could tax this. However, if we take a look at the basket of goods the lower rung pops are buying, that's going to be a relatively large chunk of the goods that they buy, and we could instead tax something that will generate us a little less money in the wine, but instead the wine will be targeting the upper strata much higher because it's a different good type. Opium is going to be the type for intoxicants, and wine is going to be a type for drinks, which is much greater consumed by the upper strata. And so we would put in our last consumption tax on the wine, or we could, increase this a little bit temporarily and put it in on transportation and have this be our consumption strategy, which I believe is the ones we had in as we started this video. Alright, so we are about to hit the Monday tick here. We have 21.5 as our middle strata taxes, 14% as our lower strata taxes, and roughly 14% as our upper strata, and our consumption taxes are about to go through. We see that it increased our upper strata by nearly 10% in terms of the taxes they're paying, about 4% for the middle strata, and 2% for the lower strata. This means we are extracting less money from the lower strata, and so we're going to negatively affect their SOL a lot less, keeping in mind that we can take 200 income from these guys and only increase nominally the amount of wealth by 40, whereas if we took 200 income from these guys, we would be, decreasing nominal wealth by like 4,000 here, right? Because we would have to multiply their income level, which is 5.9. Okay, that's not actually 5, but if we decreased it by 5, goes into 200, 400 times, 400 times. Yeah, 5 goes into 200, 400 times. 400 times their actual nominal SOL is going to be, 4,000, or, 400 times 10 is going to be like 4,000, and so we would decrease the nominal SOL in the country by 4,000 versus 40, taking money from the lower strata pop in terms of the upper strata, which is one of the reasons why what you are taxing from who is going to be so important here. Another way we can target specific goods and try and influence their prices is going to be through trade. And so often importing grain is a very good strategy for increasing SOL, because a depressed grain price, grain tends to be, if your pops aren't very rich, it tends to be the number one consumption of the lower strata. But the one I really want to focus on is going to be the consumer goods, namely clothes and furniture, because if we decrease the price of clothes or furniture in the market, this negatively affects our economy, right? It's going to make this building less profitable if these output prices are lower. However, if we decrease the price of regular clothes and increase the price of luxury clothes, the profitability remains the same. So more than any other good, in terms of trade strategy, it's going to be really good to export your luxury clothes, your luxury furniture, and porcelain, to a lesser extent on the porcelain, because this will help the buildings be more profitable, and at the same time, it will negatively affect SOL less. You can also be more aggressive. If you really want to affect SOL, you can even import regular clothes and just be as aggressive as possible importing all of these goods, while simultaneously be as aggressive as possible exporting all of these goods in terms of affecting your overall market. There's other reasons to want to trade, but in terms of trading for SOL, this is going to be what you want to do. Now let's come back to taxes for just a moment and note that your tax system is also going to determine which pops you're extracting the most wealth from. Generally speaking, the most progressive taxes, that is graduated taxation, are going to extract the most amount of wealth from the higher rung pops, and the ones that are like land-based taxation are going to be the most regressive, and they're going to extract the most wealth from your lower rung pops. And so often it can be the case, I don't think you can see the tooltip here where it says we get minus 46k from a change to graduated taxation. Despite that, we would still want to institute graduated taxation if we could, because it is going to target more the ownership class and extract more wealth from them, or more income from them, which will lower average SOL less than taxes levied upon, more lower and middle rung strata. And so this is going to be important. Also, ownership class is going to be very important in a couple of ways. Now, you can't really affect ownership too much, but you can go Council Republic followed by, cooperative ownership, which will make all of the, all the people in the building own the building or get the dividends from the building. And this will in turn raise SOL quite a lot. So if you want to really increase SOL, you have to go cooperative ownership. If you're trying to maximize, this is an essential thing. But also, kind of a less talked about feature in terms of ownership is if you want to increase SOL, you should actually turn on publicly traded, because what publicly traded does is, most of the capitalist income is actually coming from this weekly balance. This goes to the capitalists, they reinvest it, a whole lot of it, which is one of the reasons why we prefer the capitalists, because they're spending less of their money on their consumption than they are on reinvestment, and this is preferable. But this creates more capitalists, and these additional capitalists split the same kind of pie. And this is going to be really good because this will increase average SOL. If you think about it for a little bit, this is effectively like taking, let's take a look back into this tab. It's effectively like taking this 200 income and splitting it amongst the third person, which, because needs are exponential, might lower each individual's SOL a little bit, but it will create 50% more of these upper class guys with really high SOL. And so this will positively affect SOL. It's going to redistribute the wealth in a way that is going to be positive from an SOL perspective, also from a literacy perspective. In terms of increasing literacy, the higher rung pops will almost always hit 100% literacy, and this is a little thing you can do even if you are going to stay with capitalism that you can use to increase your SOL slightly. Another thing regarding ownership is that the debt from interest is also paid out to the ownership class, and so this is going to be seen as something that is kind of bad for SOL, but I still think you kind of just crank in order to stimulate the economy as much as possible in most scenarios, but this is something that is also worth noting. Now, another thing that's going to be important for SOL is going to be, of course, wages, how much money you're taking in. And in previous versions, or kind of before 1.5 changed how wages went, as you ran out of labor, wages would just skyrocket out of nowhere. So as long as you had lack of workers in the state, this would drive up wages. This doesn't really happen anywhere near as much, but it's important to know that the average wage is going to be an important driver of your SOL as well, because this will determine how much money you have in order to purchase your basket of goods and pay your taxes. We've talked about more the taxes in the basket of goods. Now we're kind of talking about income. If we take a look here, in a place that has equilibrium level employment, or places that are trying to employ up that can't, to be fair, some of this is profitability driven, and we take a look at the tooling workshop here, we'll see the average annual wage isn't that much different. It hasn't been driven up that high, and so it can be a little bit difficult to drive up average wages. However, an important thing to understand for driving up average wages is that labor-saving PMs are going to be your friend in this regard, as well as running a labor shortage. The reason for this is decreasing or using these labor-saving PMs almost always, with a few exceptions, gets rid of laborers. And laborers have a really small wage multiplier. You notice here, there's always going to be the amount that the engineers get paid is actually always directly proportional to how much the capitalists get paid, and to the laborers and the machinists and so on. Every single pop has a wage multiplier. Capitalists have a wage multiplier of 6, and engineers have a wage multiplier of 3. And so the base salary of engineers in any building will always be exactly half of that of the capitalists. The capitalists get paid the balance on top of that. They also get the dividends as well. But there is going to be a base wage that is paid to the pops. This is kind of recorded here in the wiki, and you can take a look at it. But you will see that, clerks, for example, have a wage multiplier of 1.5. So whatever the wage in the building is, the base wage, clerks will always be getting paid 50% more than a laborer. And so when you use a labor-saving PM and you decrease the number of pops that are laborers and then they go to work somewhere else as a clerk, you will raise the average wage by a lot, and this will really help for the lower strata, pulling them up. If you are getting fewer and fewer pops as laborers and swapping them over to any other profession other than peasant, although peasant's a little bit complicated and we're not going to talk about it, or slave, I suppose. That's rough. But switching pops away from being laborers into anything else will increase, other than peasants, will increase standard of living. And this is really important to emphasize. Also, and we're not going to get into it too much, you can look at and evaluate buildings as in terms of its average wage multiplier. And this is, starting to get into the weeds a little bit, but generally speaking, more industrial-oriented buildings, you see the oil rigs have an average wage multiplier when using kind of rail transportation or using tanker cars of 1.7. If you use both together, they get rid of more laborers, and the wage multiplier is even higher. You will notice a trend that, generally speaking, the higher wage multiplier is owned by the buildings that cost more construction. Steel and the motor industries in particular will have very, very high wage multipliers. And so this is another way, or focusing on these industries in particular, you could have companies for these industries in order to make them more profitable, enabling you to build a higher proportion of them and export these goods. This could be something you could do if you were just absolutely trying to max out SOL. Of course, depressing the price of basic clothing is probably more important than increasing the proportion of motor industries, and so it'd probably be more worthwhile to go for a company for the clothing, but thinking of things in terms of average wage multiplier is going to be something that you can do or can consider, and you also want to just look at the average wages in buildings. They should still go up a little bit. It just won't be anywhere near pre-1.5 levels. As you run out of labor, it should go up a little bit, but it's really going to be, it used to be running out of labor used to be the primary driver, and now I think it's much more turning on these PMs is going to be a driver. And so being more aggressive with the labor-saving PMs will increase the proportion of non-labor workers, which, as you can see in here, are getting paid by far the least. The next thing that's important for increasing SOL is going to be increasing workforce ratio as much as possible. You can see here, there's 250 workforce and 812 dependents for a little over 25% or a little under 25% of the population of this pop is going to be in the workforce. If you take a look at the income, however, we see that there are regular wages, this is going to the workforce, and dependence wages. Dependence wages only account for 10%, whereas the wages here account for, 10 total, whereas the wages here account for 76. So a vast majority of the amount of income that this pop is getting is going to workforce. So if you can increase the workforce ratio, right, then you can dramatically increase the income. And so picking every single thing you can up in order to increase workforce ratio is going to be important to this end. So, going, or dependence income, that'll increase the dependence income. This is another thing. It will increase income a little bit going on child labor allowed. I don't think it's worth it because of the mortality, but in the lack of ability to use schools, but I suppose this is worth noting. This will actually increase income. But the bigger one we wanted to show off was women's suffrage, increasing workforce ratio towards which you trend. This is an equilibrium equilibrium value. It doesn't light switch on. You trend towards it, which is why when passing women's suffrage, it doesn't feel like a big deal when you pass it, because all it does is it changes the equilibrium. But this is a dramatic change in the equilibrium and will have a long-term positive effect on your workforce ratio that is pretty robust, which is going to allow you to have pops that are going to be a higher dependent or higher proportion are going to be making the big bucks, as we saw here, in terms of looking at the pop income, a larger percentage of it is going to be in wages. Now, if we take a look at the laborers here as well, you'll notice for the laborers, again, the pop we are trying to get rid of with labor saving PM, they have a ratio that looks a little bit different, which is that the wages are only double the dependent's income, and so having higher wage multipliers is also going to help out quite a bit for having, it's more pronounced on the higher wage multiplier jobs that you are getting increased workforce ratio in terms of increasing the pop income, because moving the guys from being here to being here, it's still going to have a very dramatic effect, but it's even more dramatic on the higher paying jobs. Now, the most straightforward way of increasing your standard of living is going to be just going after health insurance, in particular public health insurance. This will give you the most to your standard of living. Just kind of cruising through them real quick. This only gives standard of living to the lower strata. To be fair, this is the most valuable, but it's only giving you minus 10% pollution effects reduction. The pollution effects reduction is also important for increasing SOL, and public health insurance gives 15%. Private health insurance only gives us to the upper strata, and it doesn't even give extra to the upper strata, so it's going to be very, very ineffective here. We will get minus mortality per wealth, but this is not, I don't think this is a good way of increasing your population anywhere near as much as public health insurance. Plus, you're going to get the increased standard of living, and you're also getting just the minus 4% mortality on everyone, which it's going to be hard to get to a wealth level for the mortality per wealth really going to be providing more. So this is the most straightforward way. The final way of doing it, as you may have noticed, we swapped to California. The final way of doing it is actually to disallow migration and keep your population as low as possible. The reason this is because if you have fewer pops in your country, and you can see here we have 3 million in California, this means there will be less average pop per resource, and this is especially pronounced if you have gold fields as well as to some extent gold mines. And so by decreasing how thinly spread per pop your really valuable resources are, and resources tend to be the most valuable, you will increase average SOL. This is one of the reasons why I think SOL is a poor metric of success, because depressing pop growth is a really good way, or depressing the amount of pops you have is a really good way of increasing your SOL. The problem is, of course, the main reason you want SOL in the first place is to get more pops, and so it doesn't really make sense, but it's in alignment with all the principles we've talked about, which is that if you don't have enough pops to work in any place, you're going to probably have to turn on all the labor saving PMs you can, which of course is going to increase the average wage multiplier. And even with doing that, there's still a good shot that you will still not have very many peasants, and peasants tend to have low SOL as well. And so in this way, you could really, really drive up the standard of living. Now, we don't have a standard of living here yet in California because we just released them, and we can see standard of living of 12, which is really not all that high. It's definitely higher than Korea, but a large part of why it's not that high is because we have a ton of peasants. Even with just our 34K employed, because the gold mines are so good for, in particular, all the workers, we can see here. Is it really their average annual wage? Is only that? I would have thought it was much higher. Is this getting paid out to the ownership? I think the ownership class is all the people in the building. But I'm not exactly 100% sure. And then they get the wage. Yeah, okay, so I think that's how gold mines work. Not 100% on the gold mines. The point is here, though, that going for a really, really low pop country can be a good way to specifically increase SOL, but I think it's not in the spirit of the main payoff of SOL is more pops. And so if you're intentionally decreasing the pops, you just dramatically crank up the SOL. I don't think it's a good metric of success, and so because of that, I tend to focus more on GDP overall rather than SOL, or even some people like to focus on GDP per capita. But this is a matter of taste, and you can kind of play for whatever you want, but if you specifically want to increase SOL, and this is all you care about, you should really think about specifically trying to limit the number of people in your country, because this will make it easier to keep the SOL high. Well, that's it for the standard of living tutorial here. If there's anything you think I missed, and I definitely missed some things, the AI turned off our construction here. I definitely missed some things. There's a lot of ways to boost SOL, but I think I came about it, kind of looking at the correct thing, which is just to think of things in terms of all of this, which is you decrease the taxes, you increase the income, and you decrease the price of your needs basket. Every sort of strategy and approach you could have for doing this will help to increase the SOL. The primary utility of SOL is going to be increasing population, but it's also good for increasing literacy, as well as managing qualifications. And finally, it will help with radicalism, especially an increasing SOL line, but it will help with radicalism as well, both increasing, not decreasing, and maintaining an SOL above your minimum expected requirement. All of these will be, an effect. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to give it a like, comment, subscribe, do the YouTube algorithm thing. And other than that, have a good day.